Now, Republicans on the House Oversight Committee, a committee we've probably become familiar with now, have released the film depositions of former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State, his wife as well, Hillary Clinton, who each testified for 6 hours in connection with a congressional investigation into the probe surrounding Jeffrey Epstein. Here are some highlights.
Do you think that Donald Trump should be deposed by this committee?
Absolutely. You know, I was a lawyer, and as a lawyer, you would look for pattern and practice. If you were deposing a witness in a case that you were trying, if you were in court, what did you know about this person? What you knew could influence how you questioned that person, how you tried the case. Donald Trump has been held civilly liable for sexual assault by a jury of his peers. 9 members of a jury found him liable in the sexual assault of E. Jean Carroll. That is behavior. That fits a pattern if one were looking for a pattern. He has also been convicted on 34 felony counts for attempting to hide his relationship with an escort, and then to commit business fraud to prevent it from becoming public in the 2016 campaign, which was ultimately election interference. So if I were running the committee or I were involved in this investigation, I would be looking for people who maybe had some prior conduct that might be relevant to either money or crimes.
There are many files where Jeffrey Epstein seems to speak as though he does know you personally. In one file, EFTA 006571115, Mr. Epstein is commenting, and he quotes, "Hey, Hillary Clinton is much prettier in person." This was Tuesday, September 20th, 2011. And then another...
Congressman,
I'm not going to object to that.
Excuse me, can I interrupt?
I have
There
another.
are photos that are being released of the secretary as she is testifying from inside this room. Can you please advise me as to whether or not that's permissible and consistent with the rules, particularly given that we have asked for a public hearing? If there are photos that are being released of the secretary as she is testifying, can you please explain how that
I'm
can
done
occur?
with this. If you guys are doing that, I am done. You can hold me in contempt from now until the cows come home. This is just typical behavior.
We will go off the record.
Oh, for heaven's
So I would like
sake.
to understand how that's permissible.
Before the hearing was...
It doesn't
Excuse
matter.
me.
We all are abiding by the same rules.
I will take that down.
Yeah,
So I would like to take a break at this moment,
yeah,
and we'd like to have a
I'm done
conversation.
for now.
Well, Lewis Goodall's here, presenter of Sunday with Lewis Goodall on LBC and co-host of the podcast The News Agents as well, of course. Lewis, we knew a bit of this content, I should say, anyway. But watching it and hearing her, I mean, there was everything in that, wasn't there? There was humour, there was drama, there was precision. She looked $1 million. She meant business when she went into that room, didn't she?
Look, I think she knew, Sheila, that she didn't want to go there. We should say that. She and President Clinton had done everything they could, tried to deploy every legal means they could to resist being summoned before Congress and this congressional committee. First time in many decades that a former US president has been compelled, mandated to attend one and to give evidence in this way, a deposition in that way. They eventually yield and give in, but I think both of them knew, and Hillary Clinton in particular had a strong was in a position to be able to prosecute their own case successfully and to try and reverse the situation, i.e. the majority party, i.e. Republicans on that committee, wanted to humiliate her. I think it was very clear from what we saw that Hillary Clinton went into that room with every intention of humiliating them. And I think at many moments, from what we've seen in terms of the 4.5 hours, 5 hours or so that have been published and then highlied and spread across
And the
social media,
Bobart-Clinton
I think
exchange,
on many
yeah.
occasions she absolutely succeeded.
Yeah. I mean, she's an impressive woman, impressive
Formidable.
performer. Yeah.
She is formidable, and I think it is at moments like that at least some people in the United States, the many millions who voted for her, 3 million more people, of course, voted for her in 2016 than Donald Trump, than they did Donald Trump, famously, will be thinking about the president that could have been. I mean, she is clear. Look, Hillary Clinton, you go back through her career, she has been subject to the most ferocious attacks, particularly from the Republican Party, for the best part of 30 to 40 years. Now, some of it may well have been justified, a lot of it will not have been. I'm sure that she felt indignation on this occasion in particular that I think a lot of people will have some sympathy with, in the sense that, as she has made clear, she never met Jeffrey Epstein. She didn't have contact with Jeffrey Epstein. She did have some contact, I think, with Ghislaine Maxwell in particular occasions, but she was basically being asked repeatedly to account for her contacts, even with people who knew Jeffrey Epstein far better even than Bill Clinton, her husband, did. For example, Howard Lutnick, who is now, of course, in Donald Trump's cabinet. This, I think, felt deeply bizarre for most people, not least when we consider, of course, something else that she has some real credibility with in terms of engaging with this committee, not least, of course, when we consider the complete asymmetry between the extent of contacts between Jeffrey Epstein and Hillary Clinton and one Donald Trump, President of the United States, who has not, mysteriously enough, been called before this committee.
I thought she set out really well why there is an argument to depose him,
to bring him before the committee. Indeed so, and she did that with her, a loyally mastery. I think Bill Clinton's appearance, by contrast, President Clinton, a rather different kettle of fish in all sorts of different ways. Of course, he has a far more difficult position in the sense that he did have a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Of course, Clinton has not actually been accused of wrongdoing, and he said that, he didn't know anything about what happens. But also, just in terms of their personal appearance before the committee, you had Clinton, whether you like her or dislike her, I don't think many people could disagree. She appeared formidable, she appeared commanding, still, deeply passionate, and still with her sort of a meticulous lawyer's brain. Bill Clinton, I think, remains, of course, a deeply charismatic man, clearly deeply intelligent man. More frail, I think it's fair to say, at this point, even though they're of almost identical age. I think we can hear a little bit of Bill Clinton now.
We believe in the minority that President Trump should also answer this committee's questions. He's someone that is mentioned almost more than any other person beside Ghislaine Maxwell in the Epstein documents. And so to get more information for this investigation, was wondering if you also agree that President Trump should answer questions of this committee.
That's for you to decide, but he did know him well, and I once had a brief discussion with him about it. The president never, this is 20-something years ago, never said anything to me to make me think he was involved in anything improper with regard to Epstein either. He just didn't. He just said we were friends, and then we had a falling out over a land deal, property deal. He somehow knew I had flown in Jeffrey Epstein's aircraft, and he said, we had some great times together over the years, but we fell out, all because of a real estate deal. And he said, I'm sorry it happened. That's all.
Do you recall whether President Trump was the first one to affirmatively bring up the subject of Jeffrey Epstein?
No, but I'd be shocked if I did. I just don't do that.
Do you recall whether President Trump elaborated at all on the great times that he had with Jeffrey Epstein?
No, and at the time, I didn't put any, sexual spin on it. The only conversation I had with President Trump about this was in the early 2000s. And I have no information that he did anything wrong. I just want it all out there. I want everybody to get it all out there and let everybody see where we are.
Look, I think Bill, as I say, Bill Clinton obviously more difficult because he had to make account of, various photographs, which, again, to emphasise, he denies any wrongdoing, but nonetheless are pretty embarrassing of him, appearing with young women, sometimes not wearing a great deal, and him having to account for that. I think, the Clintons, at the end of this, nonetheless, will be reasonably satisfied that they have managed to basically prosecute a case that, fairly or unfairly, rightly or wrongly, they have been prosecuting for the best part of 4 decades in American public life, which is that something that Hillary Clinton once called a vast right-wing conspiracy continues, I'm sure, in her mind, to be alive and well.
And they've lanced that boil to a degree, and focus might well return to Trump. We'll see in
Yes.
time. Let's talk about the spring statement. It's not a budget. It's never as big as a budget or as exciting as a budget. But
Well,
there's
Rachel Reeves
something
promised us it would be the most boring ever, which might be one promise that this Labour government can keep. It was a spring statement, which of course is, if she's been promised us, will be one fiscal event every single year. And so this is basically an update. And I have some sympathy in a sense with the Chancellor and indeed with the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is, I think, current events, Sheila, really do highlight the extent to which these medium and long-term forecasts are fantastical, in the sense that, these predictions, these forecasts which have been made, they've been obviously drawn up by the Office for Budget Responsibility over the last few months to update what we saw in the budget. What has happened even in the last 48 hours? Well, we're seeing liquid gas prices and we're seeing oil prices rise by potentially up to 100%. That will not be part of these forecasts. If that comes to pass for any length of time as a result of what we're seeing in Iran, then that will have a huge effect on all of the metrics that the Chancellor has updated us with today. So I think that this whole process, in a sense, reminds us, just frankly, that this whole way of doing economic policy making arguably belongs to a different, more settled age. I think something we can look at, though, rather than beyond just the headline GDP figures, unemployment figures, which will be more variable according to events, what we can look at is trends. Some very interesting figures in the spring statement, looking at a trend that we've seen rising for some time, which is increased welfare spending. So the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, now forecasting that welfare spending will rise by nearly 6% this year alone to £330 billion. That's equivalent to nearly 11% of gross national income. It's forecast, they're saying, to hit over £400 billion in 2030-31, largely driven by higher spending on pensioner and health-related benefits. Indeed, between 2025 and 2031, the number of people who are forecast to claim incapacity benefits is set to rise from 3.4 million to 4 million, while the number of people claiming disability benefits will rise from 6.5 to 8.8 million. These are rapid, in some cases, eye-wateringly fast increases
but we're
seeing.
The real-life chart that we've seen of future demographics in this country for a long time, which is the age, well, in part at least, the ageing population, isn't it?
Absolutely. Some of it will be pensioner spending. In fact, a good proportion of it is pensioner spending, and that is a demographic reality which is essentially inescapable unless you are going to do, of course, what many people now no longer want, which is you get more immigration from abroad of younger people. So that is a problem. But nonetheless, I think there will be more political focus in the coming weeks and months on the health and disability related part of it, because of course pensioner spending, unless you're going to dismantle the triple lock in the way we do pensions, which isn't, pensions aren't especially generous by comparison to some other countries, but if you assume that is pretty much immovable, but clearly health and disability related benefits and spending, that is a political choice. And of course, in a way, so many of Keir Starmer's problems, where the rot really started to set in terms of his parliamentary authority, is when he and Rachel Reeves went to the Parliamentary Labour Party saying we need £5 billion
and they said no.
of disability-related benefit cuts, and they said no. Problem for Keir Starmer, if he still is Prime Minister when we come to the next budget, is that, look, when we look at all of the massive demands which are now clearly going to be placed on the British state, potentially on defence alone, when we see just how uncertain the geopolitical situation is. It is harder for every pound and every penny piece that you're spending on that really rapidly galloping increase that we're seeing. It means that your freedom of movement in every other bit of government spending becomes that bit much more circumscribed, that bit harder. So I think that, this is clearly going to attract more attention, but the political capacity of the Keir Starmer government to do anything about it, well, I think is much more unknowable.
Yeah, there's plenty going on domestically, isn't there, even though all eyes are currently on Iran and the Middle East.